Hello, Leon. Nice to meet you. I am from Mexico City, and I'm going to talk about the sticky relationship between orchids and Amate paper. I'm actually an orchid student at the National University of Mexico, but I am also interested in paper, and I have been encouraged to study Amate paper, and I have found that there is actually a relationship between the two things that I love the most in biology. So it's very well known that orchids have been used in Mexico for centuries, and commonly they are harvested for decoration purposes. The upper part, we see 3 species that are used mostly to make decorations related to religious practices in different parts of Mexico, but also orchids are used as food. Probably the biggest example of that is Vanilla planifolia, and also some orchids are used for used as medicines. We have the example of Catasetum interherrinum that is used to heal stomachal diseases. And there is another kind of use that is related to the making of plant-based materials. And in this part, you see a sculpture that is actually made of a paste that is produced by mixing the dried pseudobulbs of Prostichia carwinskii and corncay. It's a practice that you can see in Michoacán in Mexico, and they use the paste to make mostly these sculptures of Jesus Christ. And all these kinds of uses have been more or less studied, but something that we know very little about is the use of orchids to make paper. Actually, these are the only references that we have about this. And on the one hand, Lenz tells us that the fibers, or actually the paste obtained from an orchid species called amatzauhtli or Epidendrum pastoris, were used in the pre-colonial era to bind the fibers to make sheets. And more recently, different authors tell us that the glue extracted from the root of the orchid, probably Epidendrum pastoris, are used to fill small gaps in the sheets, but that's all we know. And why is it important? It is because, as we saw earlier, codices have been the main resource of information regarding pre-colonial cultures. And many codices are still here with us because they were written on Amate paper. So it is thanks to Amate that we have information about the history, the philosophy, and also, we see paper figures included in the representation of different gods. Also, papers were used to make flags that were part of not only religious, but also political events. So paper, actually, Amate paper was very important in pre-colonial practices. And it was so important that even in the tribal charts that we have, we see that this symbol represents the insane amount of 8,000 sheets of paper, and several villages were demanded to send this amount of paper to the Empire of Tenochtitlan in central Mexico. So, according to different archaeological studies, the production of Amate paper was actually really expanded in the country. Most of the papermaking villages were located in the central part of Mexico, but also in the southwestern part of the country. And also, it was a very common activity back in the days. 1 century ago, the practice of Amate making survived only in this small region in western Mexico. However, today, we only find Amate making in a very small locality found in the mountains of the state of Puebla in Mexico. And this community is inside the mountains, and it's not too easy to have access to it. And the paper is mostly used to make this kind of paintings, also decorations, and to make to cut the shapes of its spirits, animals, and plants that are related to religious uses. So the questions we have are, what's the use of orchids? And what's the orchid species that is used? Or are there more species that are employed in this process? So for that, we conducted some structured interviews in San Pablito, both in the local market and in the workshops, and we documented the process through pictures and videos. So there are different components involved in amate making, which I'm going to review very quickly. To start, you have to harvest the fibers, and they usually use a single species, which is a Jonote colorado or Trema micrantha. They cut both stems or trunks, and they peel out the bark and then clean it to get only the inner bark. Once they have large amounts of fiber, they store them in these very big packages. As you can see, they are not small, and they are actually very heavy. And they store the fibers like this or like this for up to 2 years before using them. And once they want to make paper, they cook them. They use usually ashes and lime, and they cook the fibers for at least 10 hours, but they can go to 13. And they have this mechanism. Eventually, the fiber looks like this, and in the end, you have this very small volume of fiber in this very dark water that they can actually use as dye. Next, they wash the fiber with a lot of water, and something that's very common is that they bleach the paper using insane amounts of chlorine, and that's actually an environmental problem there. And to make different colors, they use anilines. Once they have the fiber prepared, it looks like this, like queso Oaxaca, as we call it in Mexico. And they spread the fibers on woven tables. They make these kind of funny patterns sometimes. It looks this messy only for quick workshops, but usually they make more arranged patterns. And to actually form the sheets, they use these stones. These are called mundo. And the process is very interesting because you have to beat it. And it's pretty cool because when you are in San Pablito, it's very common that you are hearing the beat in several parts of the town. With a first round of beating, you have this kind of striped surface, but after several rounds, you start to get a very smooth surface. And once they have done this, they take the tables out to the sun. And once the sheets are dried, there happens something very interesting, that is peeling the sheets. And we find that usually it's a very smooth process. It's common to see these small damages here and there. Although they do this very, very, very carefully. So what they do then? They use an orchid. They use the stems and they cut a small piece of other sheet of paper, and then use the pseudobulb of the orchid as a glue stick. And then it's very simple. And they use the patch in the damaged area. In this case, it was here in the edge. And they usually use a hammer. They say that the beating stone that we saw before, it can take out the patch that they have just put on. And in the end, you see this very smooth surface. And in white papers, it's actually very hard to notice in some cases. And this orchid species is not Epidendrum pastoris, but Cyrtopodium macrobulbon. And it's very interesting. It's a terrestrial orchid. It's a deciduous plant, and it's distributed all along Mexico and Central America. It's a very common orchid in Mesoamerica. And they have a special name for it. It's küiä in Otomí or Ñañú, which translates directly to glue or pegamento in Spanish. But they also call the plant camote. And something that is very interesting is that most people don't know the flower. They only care about the plant, the stems. And originally, they collected the plants from neighbor villages that are like a few kilometers away. And they cut the stems once they are fully developed, which is when they have leaves, but right before they start to fade. They cut the stems at the base, and they usually remove the most basal part to avoid staining the sheets. And what is most interesting to me is that although they sell it between each other, they cultivate the plants. One thing that is very important to consider is that once you have a single stem, you can see that they produce new stems from dormant buds that are located in the internodes. And that's very cool because they nowadays cultivate the plants both in their lands and in pots in their houses. So after the use of a single pseudobulb finishes that can take up to 3 or 6 months, they wait until the next year so they can harvest the same individual. So they don't have to go to the field to extract more plants. And according to the people, it's an innovation from the 70s. And this technique came into the game because in this period, the market increased a lot. So they started to manage large quantities of paper, and they started to see these damages very frequently. And we wonder, wait, if it's not an ancient tradition, where it came from. And in this area of Mexico that we call the Huasteca, it's very known that in the past, luthiers used the same species to make violins and guitars. So it's been proved that the pseudobulbs of these species are very good for gluing wood. And we suppose that as they have a lot of sugars, it's obvious that they can actually work for paper. But we have the question of, is this a cultural exchange, what we are seeing? And again, I told you about an orchid, right? Epidendrum pastoris. Where that name came from? Well, Francisco Hernández documented the plants of New Spain 500 years ago. And he described a very interesting plant called amatzauhtli. And he indicated that it had agave-like leaves, small flowers, reddish yellow, and spotted with red, which grow in warm regions, such as Tepoztlan in central Mexico. And let me tell you, this is not a description for this plant from Western Mexico. So what we suggest is that it's actually Trichocentrum pachyphyllum, which matches completely the physical description of the plant, but also grows in the warm regions such as Tepoztlan. And it's interesting because Lexarza synonymized both plants in 1824, and 100 years ago, Urbina interpreted the name of amatzauhtli as the sauhtli to glue paper, the glue of the paper. But we see that we don't have evidence to prove this. So in conclusions, in this study, we document for the first time the use of Cyrtopodium macrobulbon in the production of Amate paper. And contrary to what we find in literature, the use of this plant is actually very recent. And in the end, we suggest that the plant described by Hernández 500 years ago as amatzauhtli is actually Trichocentrum pachyphyllum. So that's it. Yeah, thank you so much. So now we have 1 minute for questions. So please.
The Trichocentrum pachyphyllum, was that the paper? Like, what was that? That was not the glue, right?
No, actually, we hypothesized that the name came from the shape of the leaves because it's very similar to the flags that were used in the pre-Hispanic era. Another hypothesis is that the plants grew on fig trees or amate trees, but it's something that we are still discussing with both a native and a specialist on Nahuatl language. Yeah, it's something that we still have to figure out. We have time for only one more question. Yeah.
So you mentioned that they are using chlorine to bleach
Yeah.
paper. There is any evidence that they used to bleach? Or if they did, what kind of chemical process did they use?
No, actually, they used to use fig trees, which produce actually a whitish fiber. So they had this distinction between black and white Amate, which was very important in the process of colonization and survival of this practice. Yeah. Okay, so let's go to our next speaker.